evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's always a pleasure to meet the community. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. It's good. The microphone is good. I don't have a strong voice, and I'm very excited. This is the title of my book that came out a few months ago. I don't have copies with me, but you can find it on Amazon and other places where they sell books online. And just a little bit about myself. I'm French Canadian. People are like, oh, so you're from Quebec? I grew up in Quebec, but I was born in North Bay. Basically, my parents were from Quebec. They moved to North Bay, hoping to have jobs over there. They were actually following other members of their family. I was born there. I didn't work out very well, so they moved back to Quebec. I was 1.5. So I grew up in Trois-Rivières in Quebec, very French. And people also ask me, how come your first name is so French and your last name is so English? And it's I can explain it. Basically, it goes back to a long time ago. On my mom's side, she's a Boisvert, and her ancestors arrived from France. They settled in the Quebec City area sometime in the late 1600s. On my dad's side, they were. It was a Teesdale couple that they came from England and they settled somewhere, possibly in Massachusetts. In the 1740s or 50s, but in 1752, very specific, that couple was actually captured by French and Native people from the St. Lawrence Valley, and they were taken to Quebec City in 1752. So there was no roads or anything back then connecting Massachusetts and Quebec. So that couple, they kind of understood that they would never have a chance to go back. So they decided to basically stay there. They gave up their Protestant religion. They were Calvinists, and they converted to Catholicism. And they had children in the St. Lawrence Valley, and all their children married French Canadians. So that was it. Basically, only the name survived. So on both sides of my family, my ancestors were in the St. Lawrence Valley during what we call the French regime before the British took over North America. So very fascinating. Anyone here from from Pankow or these places? Yeah. Okay. And anyone with some French Canadian ancestry? A little bit. Okay. Vancouver, I've been there a few times. It's very, it's a cool place. And I remember at the beginning when we moved to Windsor, my wife thought it was Pain Court. So, and I think a lot of people that don't come here very often, they see that, and yeah. But also, the thing is that a lot of people in Ontario don't know how the Southwest has like a long French-Canadian history. And basically, to talk about my book, first, I want to say a few words about how I became interested. Like I said, I talk about that at the very beginning of my book. Because I was born in North Bay, and I still have family in North Bay. When I grew up in Trois-Rivières, every summer we would go back and see my family for a couple weeks. And in Quebec, when I grew up, like in the 1980s, Quebecers were not really aware of the fact that there were francophone communities outside of Quebec, because a lot of people in Quebec today, you tell them that there are people who speak French in Ontario, they'll be surprised. That's the reality. There's a disconnection. But because of my family in North Bay, growing up, I was always aware of that kind of presence outside of Quebec. And so in university, I became really interested in these French-speaking communities that were living outside of Quebec. And I became interested somehow in Detroit. And when you start a PhD, one of the main concerns at the beginning is that it's one thing to have an idea and be like, oh, I want to work on this topic. But then you have to make sure that you have sources, that there are sources, because sometimes you find a topic, but really you can't find anything, so how are you supposed to write 300 pages on that? But in my case, at the very beginning of my PhD, I traveled to Detroit to go to the archives in Midtown. And I discovered so many documents, basically thousands and thousands and thousands, and many of them were written in French. So I really felt overwhelmed, but at the same time I was excited because I had enough sources, quite enough, actually too many, because then you're supposed to write like 300 pages, and there are things that you can't, like you have to leave out. You can't, 300 pages is a lot, but at the same time, there are still things that, to have like a narrative that is easy to follow. Sometimes you have to leave out a few things to focus on a specific aspect. And early on, I started to focus more like on the land question, how the French that came to a place like Detroit, the Detroit River, how they occupied the land. Because sometimes we talk about the fur trade. The French people traveled the Great Lakes back in the 18th century, and they were trading in fur and so on. So it means that they were moving quite a bit. But my interest was more about those who kind of stopped moving and decided to settle down along the Detroit River, so far away from the St. Lawrence Valley. As you may know, in the St. Lawrence Valley, up until 1760, the French government was basically organizing everything. The French government had like a very structured government based in Quebec City, and the way people occupied the land was that the government would grant a pretty large piece of land to a prominent individual, a seigneur, and then that prominent individual had to kind of subdivide his property into long and narrow pieces of land that we call in English sometimes ribbon farms. And each of these ribbon farms was for a family, a French family. So that's how it worked in the St. Lawrence Valley. And these large properties, these seigneuries, by 1760, there were about 250. So all of the shores of the St. Lawrence River were occupied by these large properties divided into smaller and very long lots. And people ask me sometimes, why did they have like these ribbon farms, very long and narrow pieces of land instead of squares like townships? And the reason is very simple. It's because having a lot of long and narrow pieces of land would give access to more people to the river, because people were using the St. Lawrence River to get around. There were very few inland roads back then, so people would use the rivers and the St. Lawrence, like the smaller rivers, and also the St. Lawrence River to move around to go see other people. So if you have townships, like squares, it would have given access to the water to a very smaller number of people. So that's the way it worked in Quebec. And I was trying to understand here in Detroit, because when I was in the archives, and that, like basically my book is based on my dissertation, but there's a lot of upgrades in my book. You know, there's also the chapter 7, there's 7 chapters. Chapter 7 is a brand new chapter. But basically, when I was in the archives in Detroit, I saw a lot of documents that pertain to land transactions. They were very similar to documents that you could find in Quebec about land properties in Quebec. And I found basically a few thousand. So I tried to understand because first I had to see, okay, does it mean that in this in the Detroit River region there were also prominent individuals that subdivided their pieces of land, their properties into long and narrow pieces of land, or how did it work exactly? Because I could also see that the people that were living along the Detroit River were paying property taxes the same way as in Quebec. And that's another thing. Sometimes we may believe that because in the 1700s, basically what is today the Great Lakes, it was mainly the wilderness and indigenous people. We may think that with the French people that came here, everything was chaotic, that they didn't really organize anything, they didn't care about their land, and they were basically, yeah, they were not really, they were different than in the St. Lawrence Valley from that perspective. But the documents I found, it was like, no, actually they cared a lot about the land. Maybe they were not the best farmers, but they truly cared about, owning a piece of land, and they paid property taxes and stuff. So it took me a while to really start to understand that society, because it was similar but also different from Quebec in the 1700s. And eventually, by doing more research in different archives, I went to the archives in Ottawa, the National Archives. I went to some other archives in Michigan, like at the University of Michigan, and a few other places. I basically understood what happened with the French people in the St. Lawrence, along the Detroit River. First thing, there were two different kinds of systems that existed over time. 1701, you may have heard of Cadillac, the founder of Detroit. A lot of people know Cadillac, the car. Like people like, oh yeah, the car Cadillac. I tell my students all the time, do you guys know what Cadillac is? And they always say, yeah, it's a fancy car. Yeah, it's named after a Frenchman, the founder of Detroit, Antoine Lamotte de Lomé Cadillac. And he established Detroit in 1701, and he did not basically get permission to start giving pieces of land like in the St. Lawrence Valley. He was not a seigneur, but he was, in his mind, Cadillac, he was so far away physically from the St. Lawrence Valley that he thought that he could basically bypass the authority of the colonial administrators in Quebec City. So that's why it's interesting that he was completely bypassing these people in Quebec City, and he was talking directly with the people that were near the king in Paris. He never talked to the king in person, but he was in touch with some of his, they were called ministers, especially one of them, someone who was very close to the king, and he was talking to him all the time, and he was able to confuse everyone, and it's fascinating. And he he didn't get permission, but kind of to start granting pieces of land along the Detroit River, and the same way, like with similar shape as in the St. Lawrence Valley, they would be long and narrow. They would front the river, the Detroit River, and they happened to be all located on what is today the American side in 1701, early 18th century. But eventually the king realized that Cadillac was collecting property taxes from the settlers, but he was keeping the money. So, because basically Cadillac kind of, he was behaving as if he was the owner of the area, the seigneur, that he behaved as if the Detroit River region was his domain, because in the St. Lawrence River, a seigneur, his property was called a domain, And and when you look at his letters, he's really talking that way. He's talking like he's telling basically the settlers that live along the Detroit River. He's telling them that they have to pay taxes and bring their taxes to his castle. Like, he didn't have a castle. He probably had a fairly decent house along the Detroit River, but he's using a vocabulary, and like he's writing in a way that he's the singer, he's the owner of the place. He never got permission to do that. That becomes clear in 1708. In 1708, what's interesting is that the King of France sent someone from France to come and travel the Great Lakes to understand what's going on in the Great Lakes, because Detroit was not the only settlement. There were a few military forts all over the Great Lakes. So that person toured the Great Lakes and stopped in Detroit for I think a few weeks, and he was not nice about Cadillac, and he wrote a report of like 100 pages, and a lot of these pages are about Cadillac. And when the king read the report, he was shocked. He didn't realize that Cadillac was really behaving as if he was the owner of this place. And you see the king. The king replies, but I mean through the ministers. You never see like letters written by the king. It's always like people around him, and these people are like, no, the Detroit River region belongs to the king himself. It's part of the king's domain, and the Cadillac he's like, no, it's my domain. So there's a bit of back and forth, and eventually they kick out Cadillac. He's no longer allowed to be in Detroit, so they give him a promotion. You know, sometimes in politics, even today, someone, someone needs to be removed from a position, but if you just remove the person like that, you yourself, the person that in the first place that appointed that person, you look silly, so you give her promotion. So that's what they did. They sent him to New Orleans to be basically the governor of Louisiana. And he caused more problems over there. So that was in 1710. So for like basically a decade, he was in Detroit. In 1716, now the colonial administrators in Quebec City are starting to have a better control over the Great Lakes, over their own staff and people in the Great Lakes, and because before that, Cadillac had been able to bypass Quebec City, the authority of people in Quebec City, but that's not happening anymore. In 1716, the governor of New France, based in Quebec City, cancels all the land titles that Cadillac had given to people along the Detroit River, and about maybe 15 or 20. So about 15 or 20 people that were living within Fort Detroit had a paper saying, a document, a deed saying that they own a piece of land along the Detroit River. 1716, all of that is canceled. No one living along the Detroit River had the permission or a formal land title. In the 1720s, despite all that, the French population of Detroit grows a little bit, and by that point, there were probably maybe 150 people. That's not a lot, but these people are starting to ask permission to farm. They want to have pieces of land, but all at the same time, they want to have actual formal land titles. They don't want to just start, farming and then being told that they can't do that, so they have to stop. Basically, they wanted land titles, and that's where, again, when we say, or when we think sometimes that because it was happening in the Great Lakes, it was probably chaotic and everything. No, people wanted to have something confirming that they have a land title. They needed a paper. So basically in the 1720s, they start sending letters to the governor in Quebec City, and they say, we live in Detroit, we want to start farming, but we don't want to do it if we don't have land titles. So there's a turning point that happens, it's in 1734. In 1734, again, land titles are granted for people to start farming along the Detroit River. In 1734, and again, it's on the American side of because there's no United States at that time. It's on the other side of the river in 1734. So, and also for the first time, what's interesting is that not only people receive land titles and they were allowed to start farming, but people for the first time in 1734 started to move from within the fort to directly on their property. Before 1734, all the French people that were living in Detroit were actually living within the fort. In 1734, people wanted to build houses, barns, stables on their farm because they feel like if they live on their farm, it's a lot easier for them to take care of their livestock and everything. Because before that, before 1734, people would live within the fort, and every day they would go, well, that was before 1716, people would leave the fort every day and go take care of their farm, where there was probably no building or nothing, and then they would come back. 1734, that changes. People start building houses along the Detroit River. And in the same process, they start doing something very interesting, planting fruit trees. Pear, apples, and so on. And they start growing fruits, fruit trees and fruits along the Detroit River. In 1749, for the first time, land titles are given for land on this side of the river. So now in the 1750s, you have farms, buildings on both sides, and now they're really covering like 15, 20 kilometers on each side, and a lot of these farms have apple trees, and usually these apple trees are close to the buildings. All the buildings are located along the river. So you have pieces of land that are long and very narrow, and all the buildings are close to the river, and so are the apple, the fruit trees. So when you're on the river, you feel like there's a lot of fruit trees, and it looks like a long village because all the buildings are by the river. But there's an event that changed the history of North America. It's the conquest of New France in 1760. And the conquest was confirmed by the Treaty of Paris 3 years later in 1763. So all of New France is gone. The French people, of course, stayed where they were, and that's why people speak French in places like Quebec today. But the government became British. And the French people that were living along the Detroit River, they didn't go anywhere, they stayed where they were. But now, it became complicated for them to receive more land titles because these French people are having a lot of kids. If you look at these genealogy books right here, 12 kids was pretty normal, sometimes more than that. So eventually, especially your sons, maybe they would like to have their own farm. So what the French did, they did the same thing in Quebec, is that sometimes they would kind of subdivide a family property, so even more like narrow, but you can't subdivide like forever. So eventually some of the sons need their own piece of land. But the thing is that in the 1760s and 70s and the 80s, for like 3 decades, the British government did not want to give land titles to any Europeans in the Great Lakes. And in fact, the British authorities were saying they thought that the French should not be along the Detroit River. That was basically what the people that are really like the governors and people really high up thought. That they were based in New York City, because again, the U.S. did not exist yet at that time. But at the local level, you would have, when the British conquest happened, you went from having in the fort a French commander to having a British commander. And these commanders, they would stay in that position in Detroit for like 1 to 3 years. So every 1 to 3 years, you would have someone new coming, having to get familiar with the local people. And what happened is that almost all the British commanders that came to settle, to live, to be in charge of Fort Detroit between the 1760s, 70s, and 80s, they basically gave all kinds of informal permissions to the French. So basically the French continued to, without having actual land titles, to occupy more and more land, to farm and build houses. And they basically, they took these lands from native people. So the French kind of, in a way, they kind of tricked the native people. They were friends with them, and they said, "Oh, you're not using this piece of land, can I have it?" Also, and the French would basically put together a document, and they would ask the native chiefs to sign the document, and then the French felt like they had some kind of land title, but the British government did not recognize that. The other event that happened is the American Revolution, the creation of the United States, the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, and then the war between Britain, because Britain, when the U.S. seceded, there were only 13 states initially. They were all along the Atlantic coast. When they declared their independence, Britain said, "No, you're not seceding from us." So they went to war, and in the end, it's not that the Americans won, but the British kind of gave up. And then in 1783, it's really, the U.S. really exists, recognized by other countries. And the people that were living in the U.S. that wanted to stay, to remain loyal to the British Crown, they basically had to leave. Their houses sometimes were destroyed by their neighbors, or their things were stolen and that kind of thing. So a lot of these people came to Canada. Maybe you're a descendant of loyalists. My wife is from Gananoque near Kingston, and it's really loyalist country. Everyone over there can, like, they do their genealogy, they're almost all descendants of loyalists. It's very interesting. So I mentioned that the British government did not want Europeans to live in the Great Lakes between the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. But overnight, having a few thousand British loyalists moving north, the British government had to do something, and they wanted to avoid any conflict with the native people in the Great Lakes. So that's when all of a sudden, starting in the 1780s, the British government signed treaties of land cession with indigenous people in the Great Lakes, in what is today Ontario, more specifically. And then after doing that, the British authorities in the late 1780s started to try to clarify what's going on in terms of land titles in what is today Ontario. And they know that there are people that were already here, like the French people. So now there's they create commissions, they appoint people in different parts of the province to essentially, at the local level, these commissioners would ask everyone who claims a piece of land to come and state their claim, basically. So the people come, sometimes they have a written document of some old deed or something. If they don't, have to bring it a witness who can say, yeah, this guy has been cultivating the land for 20 years and so on. So the government is trying to make sense of all that, to clarify everything in different parts of the province, and they write down everything. So the French people that, since 1760, we're not sure exactly if their land titles would be recognized by the British, and overnight, all their land titles are recognized. Even if they didn't have any paperwork, everything is recognized around 1789, 1794, but only on this side of the border. Because when the American Revolution happened in 1783, the Treaty of Paris that ended the war between Britain and the US, they decided that the border would be located, that the Detroit River and also the St. Clair River would be the border between British North America and the US. So that's why there was everything that was on the other side, the British wouldn't do anything because it was supposed to become part of the US. That's not exactly what happened. For 13 years, the British actually kept occupying forts that were located on the other side of the border. For example, Fort Detroit was supposed to be American in 1783, but the British continued to occupy Fort Detroit until 1796. So between 1783 and 1796, for example, the French people who were living on the other side of the river were not quite sure what was going on. They knew that they were supposed to now be part of the U.S., but the local officers were British. So in 1796, finally, Britain and the U.S. signed another treaty, and once and for all, the British officers left Detroit, they left the American side, and American troops took over Fort Detroit. And on the other side, so on the American side now in 1796, the American government did exactly the same thing as the British government on this side. They created commissions to look into who claimed like private ownership of pieces of land and so on. And then in the Detroit area, it's interesting when you look at the Americans with the correspondence, the letters among themselves, and they don't like that the French are there because the French organized the land with their ribbon farms, and they would like to basically get rid of the French and reorganize everything into townships. But then they're like, well, the British on the other side were so nice with the French, they recognized their land titles. We have to do the same thing, basically. So the Americans did the exact same thing. At one point, it didn't matter if you had paper to confirm some kind of deed or not. As long as you would bring a witness, they had these commissions, same thing. People would come and state their case. Eventually, more than 700 private claims, they call that the private claims, were recognized on the American side, most of them by French people. So basically now you're close to the War of 1812, and what you have is that along the Detroit River, on both sides, you have families, French families, and most of them have relatives living on the other side. And they also have friends, and people just basically, it's not like today, the border, there's no bridge or nothing like that. And also if you would, basically you could just get in a canoe across the river, and that was it. No one would tell you, hey, no. That was it, basically. So people knew each other, and so that was what the Detroit River area looked like in 1812. So when the war started in 1812, the French people were not happy about it. They did not want a war. They were forced basically to enroll in the militia and that kind of thing. A lot deserted, and sometimes they deserted to go hide among relatives on the other side, and it went like both ways, and it got a little confusing. But basically, when the war of 1812 ended, everyone was happy for sure. So these are things I talk about in my book, and I talk about a few other things. For example, French-Canadian migrations to here. Sometimes we have, when I was reading it initially at the beginning of all my research, by reading a few things, I felt like Okay, the French kind of stopped coming to Detroit in 1760 when New France was over. When the British took over North America, the French stopped coming here. But then I was like, no, actually there are probably more French people who came here after, when it was British, came from Quebec. So I started to look into that. And today, in my research on the French people, I kind of continue looking at French Canadians who left Quebec to come a place like the Detroit River region, but also all the way to Kent County. People that came between like roughly 1790 to 1850s. So that's what I've been doing lately, and that's what I plan on doing for the next few years. So I will most likely come and visit the local archives for my research. Yeah, because there's so much more to do. And just one last thing about what I do at the University of Windsor. I teach a lot of local history, and our definition of local history, it comes all the way to Chatham. Basically, it includes Sarnia, and also on the American side, all of Southeast Michigan, all the way down to Monroe, and even Toledo, Ohio. So I teach courses on local history. I teach courses on Canadian history, Aboriginal history, and also more and more courses on on borders in North America over time. So I do a lot of what we call borderland studies or border studies, and now with the last election in the United States, everything that has to do with borders is more and more important. So the University of Windsor is, as you know, is located right on the border. So we can't be closer than that. We have a strong focus on that, and I happen to be working on that. So all of a sudden, I'm involved in all kinds of cool projects to better understand how people who live close to the border understand their lives and that kind of thing. So yeah, I come to Chatham a few times a year. I have 3 boys, 10, 8, and 4, and we come to Chatham sometimes to go to the splash pad and things like that. So yeah. So do you have any questions? Yes.
Do you know when Fort Detroit was actually started?
It started in 1701.
1701.
Yes, 1701. When Cadillac came to establish the fort, he came with, there were a few canoes. It was basically all men from the St. Lawrence Valley. Some of them were from France. And they built like a mini fort basically, and inside they built a church and a few other buildings. And that was the creation of the founding of Detroit, 1701. That fort was located right downtown. If you cross today the tunnel, if you turn left, you can't turn left because today you have to go straight and then come back. But if you could turn left on Jefferson Avenue, it would be right there in that little park. That's where the fort that the French people established was located. Yes, 1701. Yeah.
Was there one particular time period when the French Canadians came into Windsor area in larger groups?
Basically 1730s and between the 1730s and 1830s, it was pretty even every decade basically. In 1749, 1750, and 1751, the French government sponsored the migration of French families from the St. Lawrence Valley to here, sponsoring by basically covering the cost of sending them here, but also giving them some animals, some livestock, and some tools to get started farming here. So yes, there was a bit of a boost in 1749, 1750, and 51, but a lot of people continued to come after that. And also, like I said, one of my current projects is that 1790 to 1850s in Quebec. A lot of people think that French Canadians started to leave Quebec in the 1850s because there were no more land available, And also in the 1850s, you have the construction of railways, so it becomes a lot easier to travel to other parts of North America. For example, a lot of families left Montreal to go to Boston and work in the factories. There's a lot of research on that. But my research is that I'm actually showing that a lot of French Canadians did not wait for the construction of railways to leave, because it was already hard way before the 1850s to find good land in some parts of the St. Lawrence Valley. So quite a few families left, for example, in 1810, 1820, 1830. Some of them came here, like Kent County, yeah.
So their major mode of transportation would have been on bateaux
Yes.
down the St. Lawrence versus wagons, walking.
Yes, up until the 1830s, it was by water. And also, the thing is that in the 1820s and 30s, now you have steamboats. So I don't know if French Canadians basically were able to get on steamboats, for example, where you have Buffalo, New York today, and on Lake Erie. I'm not quite sure, but before the 1840s, it was still by water. That was the fastest way. There were a few roads in Ontario in the 1820s and 30s, but they were in extremely bad shape, and people were complaining a lot about that. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I have a couple questions, but I want to thank you first, one for being here, but also for writing this book. One, I've been honored with one of your history awards from the university, the medallion.
Yes.
And I haven't owned this book too long, as you're well aware of. It hasn't been out on the market that long. This book you talked about, and it's probably one of my most dog-eared books already. I read it the first week I got it. It is fantastic. I got it well marked because I'm working on a book on Native Indians. And there's some pretty different information in here that's not in other books. For the people here, I just want to point out one thing that is in the book. Chapter 7 that you said you added. There's a quote in here by Hugh Callan. And we're working on Hugh Callan's second book. This third book's out. I already published it. The fourth book I probably never will. Here's the first one which you used with the quote.
Okay.
Okay, we agreed on that. So people can get it out. My question is though, are you looking at volume 2 and 3? Because at the same time period, there's a lot of different things that have happened that in that time you didn't have.
Yeah.
space
Well,
to do.
now I'm focusing mainly. Yes, I'm working on the sequel, but it will cover basically the 1790s to the 1860s. But I'm interested in, for example, I'm trying to understand because today, when you're in Detroit or in Windsor, you see like an urban environment, you know? So it's very difficult for people to imagine that basically what happened in the 1820s and from the 1820s to 60s is that on both sides you had French farms, and little by little, like, cities were basically built right on top of the French farms. So I'm trying to understand that process. I know that it happened faster on the American side because Detroit became way bigger than Windsor. We all know that. But it's more complicated than that. Like some of the French owners, they did not want to. Like they were aware in the 1820s and 30s that Detroit was growing around them, but they still wanted to stay on their farm. And some Americans were complaining about that. So I'm curious to see how it happened on both sides, but it won't be ready for a number of years. Yeah.
No, I've done it. I've put out a couple dozen books on local history in the Western District, plus Michigan and Ohio, which are teaching. And it's nice to see, some of the books coming out there, filling in the holes that I've left. And to get them out, I highly want to recommend this book to people. If you're interested in French at all, French story, this is fantastic.
Yes.
I have family, that own farms at St. Regis, just outside of Cornwall,
Yes.
and they lost their farms. The government gave the farms to the native people.
Yeah, that's yeah. It's that the history of that region is a little different, but the land question in Canadian history is yeah, it's very it's a big thing. Yeah.
My family was in the Mohawk Valley, and they were Mennonite background. And during the Revolution, some of them joined up with the American forces, and some with the troops from Niagara. And there were others that chose to go west through up to Wisconsin. And was there a movement west at any time after the Revolution that was detected in your research?
After the American Revolution, it took a few decades actually for non-Indigenous people, Europeans, to actually make their way to places like Wisconsin, because the U.S. government did not yet have control over these areas. Still, the U.S. government, their approach, like to deal with Indigenous people on their side of the border, was to go to war against them, basically. But today we see the U.S. as this superpower, but back in the 1790s, early 19th century, not quite yet. So it was not that easy to basically force the Indigenous people to surrender, sign treaties, to go live on reserves. It's a process that really started after the War of 1812, because during the War of 1812, up until the War of 1812, Indigenous people in the Great Lakes were still able to get organized and basically resist American expansion, but because they basically lost the War of 1812, after the War of 1812, what the U.S. government did is that for the first time they started to build new forts in the Great Lakes, all over the Great Lakes, and then they would have troops at all these locations, and that started only after the War of 1812. So it made it more possible for Americans from the East Coast to West, all the way to Wisconsin, more like in the slowly 1820s and 30s, slowly. In the case of Michigan, what's interesting is that people would, what happened in the, it's in 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, so it became a lot easier for people like in the Boston area, but also New York City to move west, because now it would take only 1 or 2 weeks from New York City all the way to Detroit, which at that time was a big change, much faster than before. So after the construction of the Erie Canal, so in the late 1820s and after that, you have a few thousand migrants every year that move west. Eventually it's like tens of thousands. But what's interesting is that in the 1820s and 30s, a lot of these people basically they come to Detroit, but they don't stay in Michigan. They move to Illinois and other places west. Why? Because there's this, what the U.S. government would do is that they would, like ahead of the arrival of people, they would send surveyors to examine the land and all that, the soil. And there's this guy who was in charge of, he was in charge of Michigan, but he was actually living in Ohio. And I think it's in 1817, he sent one of his assistants to take a look at Michigan. And they determined that the land was of poor quality in Michigan. It wasn't true, but they basically didn't really actually look. And but just because of that, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not going to Michigan, the land is not good. So it kind of delayed by like a couple decades almost, the development of some parts of Michigan in terms of agriculture. But yeah, by the 1840s, 30s, 40s, you start having a few thousand people in Wisconsin. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, one.
I'm looking up some of these old French names.
Yes.
And I noticed this in my own history, and they'll say Jean-Baptiste Prudhomme D.
Yes.
What does a D mean?
AKA. It means AKA basically. And very often it would say D something, and very often that second surname basically refer to some feature, or it could be like the landscape, for example. Sometimes it would be like des ruisseaux, which means by the creeks. So it's because maybe at one point that family lived by some.
By the creek,
by
and
the
then
creeks.
by the creek become their name?
Yes, in many cases, not in all cases. It's the same thing in Quebec and in this area, that in the 19th century, like starting in the 1830s and all the way to the 1890s, the families, they basically get rid of one, and some got rid of the first surname and others from the second surname. So it's very confusing.
Confusing.
Yes.
Now, there's another one, D-A-U.
D-A-U.
Uh,
Oh, that means, it means daughter.
It means daughter?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this genealogy, a lot of names have been anglicized on purpose. In my book, I use the original French names, and that's one of the advantages that I feel I have when I look at families. When I use some documents that the name is anglicized, because I grew up in Quebec, French is my first language, I can more easily determine, or actually this name is this, or it used to be this and this, and I establish even more connections than people who don't speak French. That's the reality. So on purpose, I really, in my book, I really kept the French, the original French versions of spelling. Yeah, there's in my book there's a few things that surprise a lot of people. If you're familiar with Detroit, there's also within Detroit the city of Hamtramck, and a lot of people think, oh, it has to be Polish or something. It sounds Eastern European, but like I mentioned in my book, actually, that man Hamtramck, he was French Canadian. He was born in Quebec City. His name was Jean-François. They call him John or John Francis. And when the American Revolution started, 1776, the Americans, like basically, they asked the French Canadians to join them against the British. Some Americans went to Quebec, and they were like, "Hey, you guys, we know you don't like the British. You don't like being under the British rule. Join us." And the vast majority of people said no, but a few said yes. And Jean-François Hamtramck, he was one of them. So he moved to the U.S. He enrolled in the army, and he climbed the ladder. And when 1796, when the U.S. takes over Michigan, they know that the area is very French. So they make sure that among their military officers, they have a few French-speaking people, including Jean-François Hamtramck. And he purchased the property from old families that were already there along the Detroit River, and he died in Detroit. And eventually, they created some kind of neighborhood that started at the river, and it was called Hamtramck. But eventually, they changed the boundaries, and it was at one point it was no longer touching the river, and that's what you have today. It's like surrounded by Detroit. And immigration in the late 19th century, early 20th century from Eastern Europe, a lot of Polish people, for example, lived in that area, so it became very Eastern European, but originally he was French Canadian. Hamtramck, it is more like an Eastern European name. It's not French, but somehow He was born in Quebec City back in the I think in 1750s. Yeah.
Great, just like Teasdale, not very French.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I know there's a lot of folks here that have Kent and Essex and Lambton. The borders kind of were all back and forth.
Yeah.
So I know I have family that was back and forth. So
Yeah.
that was a great presentation. We wish
Oh,
to thank
oh,
you on
thank
behalf
you.
of the branch.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm sure you'll stick around in case there's questions.
Yep.
And as you mentioned, we have resources too. So I brought in a couple things from the library, but we do have a collection of French resources up in our library.
Mhm.
Also, the French Society in Windsor.
Yep.
I don't know if you've accessed anything there.
Yep.
They're a great resource if you have any French ancestors as well. They're at the Maryvale. They've located the old Maryvale Convent. It's on Prince Avenue. Fantastic place to go. And I think that's it. We have some new family history charts at the back if you're interested. And I think that's a wrap. If anybody has any other questions, if not, help yourself to snacks. Chris is back there to chat a little bit more history. We have our own local historian, Frank is here for Kent County history. A bunch of the other folks here are very knowledgeable. So thanks very much for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.